It was an ordinary afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind where the sun offered just enough warmth to make the breeze feel refreshing. Outside a quiet cafe on Melrose Avenue, Clint Eastwood sat at a table, wearing sunglasses that partially concealed his face. Despite the years that had softened his features, his presence was unmistakable. Passers-by occasionally glanced his way, unsure if they should disturb the legendary actor's peaceful moment. Across the street stood another man, mostly unnoticed. His clothes were worn and layered, each piece telling the story of his time spent outside. His hair was messy, and he gripped a small cardboard sign with one hand while nervously fidgeting with his pocket with the other. His name was Kevin, and this marked the third week he'd been sleeping behind a dumpster near a convenience store. He hadn't had a full meal in 2 days, and hunger gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how much his life had changed. As he looked around the cafe, his eyes eventually landed on Clint Eastwood. For a moment, Kevin hesitated. What could a man like that possibly want with someone like him? But hunger does strange things to pride, and so Kevin made his way across the street. Each step felt heavier than the last, and his voice was barely a whisper when he reached Clint's table. "Sir, can you spare $1?" Clint looked up slowly, removing his sunglasses. His expression was unreadable, and for a second Kevin feared he'd made a mistake. But then Clint leaned back, studying Kevin like he was trying to understand the story behind the man. Time seemed to stretch, and Kevin's nerves began to fray. He almost apologized and walked away when Clint finally spoke. "$1, huh?" Clint's tone was neutral. Then with a slight smile he added, "Sit down. Let's talk." Kevin blinked in surprise. Sit down with Clint Eastwood? Was this a joke? He scanned Clint's face for any sign that this wasn't real, but there was nothing but calm curiosity, a quiet invitation that made Kevin feel both exposed and oddly comforted. "Thank you," Kevin mumbled, before carefully lowering himself into the chair across from Clint, his hands trembling as he placed his sign on the table, keeping it low to avoid drawing attention. Clint's gaze remained steady, not judgmental, but curious, as if he genuinely wanted to know the man behind the sign. Kevin had grown used to people either ignoring him or tossing him a coin without a second thought. No one had wanted to hear his story in years, but Clint did. "I'm sorry if I'm bothering you," Kevin stammered, his voice raw. "I don't usually ask. I've been trying to find work, but it's harder than I thought it would be." He glanced at his hands, ashamed of how desperate he sounded. Clint said nothing. He simply listened, which was more than most people had done in years. Kevin took a deep breath, and the words began to spill out. "I used to be a contractor, had a crew, steady work. Then the recession hit, and the jobs dried up. The savings ran out, and then came the late notices." He paused, his throat tight. After that, his voice trailed off, but it wasn't because he couldn't find the words. It was because he didn't want to. He let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, right? I spent my whole life building homes for people, and now I can't even keep a roof over my own head." Clint's expression remained calm, but Kevin could feel the man's eyes soften as he spoke. Kevin felt the familiar sting of shame creeping up again and tried to steer the conversation away from himself. "I know you probably get asked for things all the time," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't mean to be just another guy with a handout, but I don't know what else to do anymore." Clint didn't brush him off. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was steady, but it carried a weight. "What's your name?" Kevin blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. Kevin," he muttered. Clint nodded thoughtfully. "Kevin," he repeated, testing the name like it held some meaning. After a pause, Clint spoke again. "You know, Kevin, I've played a lot of roles in my life. Cowboys, soldiers, detectives. And one thing I've learned is that everyone has a story, no matter how good, bad, or ugly it is. What matters is how you carry it. So let me ask you something. What's the next chapter of your story?" Kevin stared at Clint, unsure if the man was serious. "The next chapter?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. Clint nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're still here, right? You're still breathing, still talking, still asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So what's the next chapter? Kevin felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't have an answer. For so long, he'd been stuck in survival mode, not thinking about the future. I don't know, he finally admitted, barely above a whisper. I guess I just want to make it through the day. Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. That's not a chapter, Kevin. That's just a sentence. You need a chapter, a real one, something you can build on. Kevin felt frustration building up inside him, but he held his tongue. Clint continued, look, life's not going to hand you easy answers, but you've got to decide if you're going to let it break you or if you're going to use it to build something. Kevin swallowed hard. I don't know if I can trust that, he muttered. I've tried places like that before. They don't really help people like me. Clint's gaze softened slightly, but his voice was firm. People like you? What does that even mean? Kevin looked away, his heart heavy with all the bitterness he'd carried. You wouldn't get it. Guys like me are just forgotten. Clint leaned in a little closer, his voice quiet but resolute. You think I've never been down? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like the world's against you? I grew up dirt poor during the Depression. I know what it's like to go to bed hungry, not knowing what tomorrow might bring. But let me tell you something, Kevin. It's not about how hard you fall. It's about whether or not you're willing to get back up. Kevin looked up, startled. Clint's words hit him harder than expected. It's not that simple, he said, his voice cracking. Clint exhaled slowly. No, it's not. It's hard as hell. But if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been. Kevin didn't say anything more. He just stared at the business card Clint had handed him. It felt like a lifeline, but doubts clung to him. Still, for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him. A small spark of hope, maybe, or the realization that he had nothing left to lose. I'll think about it, Kevin said, his voice quiet. Clint nodded. That's all I'm asking. Kevin stood up to leave, clutching the card in his hand, unsure of what to feel. Clint had made a difference, more than anyone had in a long time. The words Clint had shared echoed in Kevin's mind, urging him to take a step forward. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Kevin knew he had to at least try. Later, as Clint sat alone sipping his coffee, he couldn't shake the memory of their conversation. It had reminded him of his own past, of the strangers who had stepped in when he needed help most. He knew that by offering Kevin a chance, he was passing along the same kindness he'd once been shown. As Kevin walked away from the cafe, he wasn't sure how to feel, but the card Clint had given him, tattered and worn, felt like the first real step towards something different. He went to the shelter, cleaned up, and eventually found a job. With time, he built a new life. He kept Clint's business card, and months later, he wrote a letter to thank him. Clint didn't expect a reply, but when he read it, a small smile appeared on his face. For Clint, it was never about recognition. It was about paying forward the kindness that had once been given to him. And for Kevin, that simple moment on Melrose Avenue was the start of a new chapter, one that reminded him of the power of second chances and human connection. If this story moved you, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's continue to spread the power of compassion and hope.